Picture two images in your mind at the same time. The first, a map. The Solomon Islands, a double chain of jungle covered volcanic islands stretching roughly 500 miles through the southwest Pacific, oriented northwest to southeast like a crooked finger pointing from the equator towards Australia. Between the two chains runs a deep water corridor, roughly 20 to 30 miles wide. The Allies named it the Slot. The Japanese called it their highway. Running blacked out at 30 knots through a moonless Pacific night, destroyer captains who knew those waters could transit the full length in a single night. South to resupply a besieged garrison. North again before dawn brought Allied aircraft. The second image, the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, the stretch of water off the northwest coast of Guadalcanal in the spring of 1943. Down there, in water that averages roughly 1,000 feet deep, lies dozens of warships from both sides of the Pacific War, American and Japanese, cruisers, destroyers, transports, a carrier, all of them put there by the campaign that just ended. The battle for Guadalcanal ran from August of 1942 until February 9th of 1943. 6 months of grinding, catastrophic naval combat that cost both navies more ships and men than most wars produce in a lifetime. On February 9th, 1943, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. The island that had defined the Pacific War for 6 months was gone. And now, hold both of those images, the map and the graveyard. Because what happened next and why it matters is where this story begins. The end of Guadalcanal was not the end of the campaign. It was barely a rest stop. The war shifted northwest. The Japanese weren't retreating all the way home. They were falling back to the next line of defense. And that line ran through the Central Solomons, anchored by two airfields they were building as fast as their men and their dwindling supply ships could manage. One was Munda on the western coast of New Georgia, not yet operational as a combat base, functioning mainly as a refueling station for aircraft flying south out of Rabaul. The other was under construction at Villa Stanmore on the southern coast of Kulumbangara, a nearly perfect circular volcanic island that sat like a sentinel northwest of New Georgia, separated from it by the Kula Gulf to the east and the Blackett Strait to the south. These two airfields were not just infrastructure, they were the entire logic of Japanese strategy in the Central Solomons in early 1943. Hold those islands, keep those runways operational, and you can contest Allied air power over the slot. Lose them, and the road opens towards Bougainville, and ultimately towards the great Japanese base complex at Rabaul, the hub of Japanese power in the entire Southwest Pacific. The Allied strategic plan had a name: Operation Cartwheel. The goal was not to take Rabaul directly, it was to encircle it, isolate it, strangle it. Isorako Yamamoto understood this. The men building the airstrip at Vila in the rain understood this, even if they couldn't articulate the grand strategy. The runway they were grading out of the jungle was a stake in the ground. Every shovelful of dirt mattered, and every shovelful had to be protected by a navy that was running low on destroyers it could afford to lose. Here is what you need to understand about the United States Navy as it entered 1943 in these waters. It had survived Guadalcanal. It had not, by any honest measure, mastered the night. The Japanese owned night surface combat in the Pacific in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate now. They were not simply good at it, they had built their entire surface navy doctrine around it. Their lookout teams could identify ships at ranges American radar operators struggled to match. They had trained for years in the dark, in confined island waters, in exactly these conditions. And they had a weapon to match their doctrine, the Type 93 torpedo. The weapon historian Samuel Eliot Morison nicknamed the Long Lance, an oxygen fueled, wakeless torpedo that ran faster, further, and hit harder than anything the American surface fleet was carrying. Not a little better, dramatically better. The Battle of Tassafonronga, November 30th, 1942, 3 months before the engagement you're about to hear, is the proof. 8 Japanese destroyers on a supply run, 5 American cruisers, and 4 destroyers with radar contact. An ambush. The Americans opened fire. The Japanese, caught flat-footed, supplies still on deck, had no time to shoot back in any organized fashion. What they did instead was launch torpedoes, long lances, at ranges American doctrine said were not tactically viable. The torpedoes ran. 1 American heavy cruiser went to the bottom. 3 more were put out of action for months. The Japanese lost 1 destroyer. The Americans, with radar contact, with a numerical advantage, with the element of surprise, lost that fight. That is the context. That is the scale of what needs to change. 23 nights later, across the waters from where Yamamoto's admirals were still running the Tokyo Express, up the slot, a newly promoted rear admiral from Mississippi was thinking about how to make the dark work for him instead of against him. His name was Aaron Stanton Tip Merrill. And 23 nights after that, on the pitch black pre-dawn of March 6th, 1943, in a patch of water between the islands of New Georgia and Kulambangara, he would prove that the night no longer belonged to Japan. But here's the thing that textbooks leave out of that sentence. The night he chose to prove it was the same night a submarine with 71 men aboard disappeared forever. And those two facts are not separate stories. They are the same story, seen from different angles of the same darkness. The question is not just what Tip Merrill changed. The question is what it cost and who got to play it. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph. Welcome to the U.S. Navy History Podcast.
Hello. What an intro. Golly. Okay, I'm primed. I'm ready. I can't wait to hear what comes next.
On February 9th, 1943, the American general commanding ground forces on Guadalcanal sent a message to Admiral Halsey that read simply, Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. 7 words. 6 months of blood summarized in 7 words. And then, because the war moves whether you're ready for it or not, the Tokyo Express pointed northwest and kept running. I want you to understand what that expression actually means, what it meant for the men who ran those ships. Before we talk about the 2 destroyers that ran their last mission on March 5th and 6th, 1943, because Murasame and Minagumo didn't appear out of nowhere. They were not fresh ships on their first run. They were the end of a long road. And that road has a texture that matters. The Tokyo Express was born out of necessity, and it ran on desperation. When Allied air power made daylight reinforcement of Guadalcanal suicidal for slow cargo ships, the Japanese Navy did what the Japanese Navy was built to do. It improvised around the problem at speed and in darkness. Fast destroyers running blacked out at 30 plus knots down the slot and back in a single night. The logic was brutal and simple. You couldn't hit what you can't see. and what you can't see what's already gone before dawn. The supply system they developed tells you everything you need to know about how badly the situation had deteriorated. A destroyer is not a cargo ship. She has no cargo holds, no cranes, no proper loading infrastructure. So the Japanese Navy came up with this: heavy steel drums, the kind normally used for oil or gasoline, cleaned out and sterilized, then partially filled with rice, medical supplies, ammunition. Enough air left inside to keep them floating. A destroyer could carry roughly 200 of these drums, strung together in clusters, stacked on her deck and lashed to her railings. When the ship reached the drop point off the coast, sailors rolled the drums over the side without stopping, the ship never slowing, never lingering, and barges ashore were supposed to retrieve them with ropes before daylight. I want you to sit with what that actually means. A warship built to fight, to launch torpedoes and fire guns and conduct fleet actions, reduced to a floating drum rack. Sailors standing on deck in the dark, rolling cargo over the side by hand, hoping the drums would float to the right beach before American aircraft found them at dawn. On a typical night in December 1942, 1,500 drums went into the water. 300 were recovered. The other 1,200 and whatever food and medicine they contained sank, floated off, or were strafed to pieces by morning. The men on Guadalcanal, who those drums were meant to feed, were already starving, already wrecked by malaria, already dying faster from disease than from American bullets. The Tokyo Express kept running anyway. It was all that was left. Now, hold that image of those sailors rolling drums over the rail in the dark and meet the ships. Murasame translates as passing shower. She was a Shira Tosyo class destroyer, laid down in 1935, commissioned in January 1937. By the standards of her era, she was a first-class fleet destroyer. 107 meters, 34 knots, 5-inch guns, and 8 Type 93 torpedoes and 2 quadruple launchers. That torpedo battery matters. 8 long lances, the oxygen-fueled, wakeless weapon that had already humiliated American cruiser squadrons in the darkness around Guadalcanal. She had been at the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942. She had been part of the aborted Midway invasion force in June 1942. She had been making Tokyo Express runs since early October 1942. 9 of them in late October and November alone. 9 runs through the slot. 9 nights of 30-knot transits, rolling drums over the side, turning north before dawn. In those runs, she took an air attack hit that damaged her, went back to truck for repairs, and returned. Minagumo, or Summit Cloud, was a Asha Shiho class destroyer, a step up from Murasame in size and capability. Laid down in 1937, commissioned in April 1938, the Asashio class was Japan's answer to its own decision to stop pretending the London Naval Treaty applied to them. Bigger, faster, and armed with the same 8 long lances. Minagumo had been at the Java Sea. She had been at the Eastern Solomons in August 1942. She had taken air attack damage so severe on an October 5th supply run that she'd had to limp back to Yokosuka for repairs. She was back in action by February 22nd, 1943. Exactly 10 days before she would be sent back down the slot to Vila. These were not expendable conscript vessels. They were experienced, veteran warships crewed by men who had survived years of combat operations across the length of the Pacific. By early 1943, that experience was exactly what made them valuable and exactly what made them so hard to replace. Now, I want to tell you about the night of November 12th into the 13th, 1943, the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, because Murasema was there. And what she was part of that night connects the story to something most Americans know, even if they don't know the name of the ship. And the chaos of that close range night action off Savo Islands. A Mei Lee so confused that an American officer later described it as, quote, a barroom brawl after the lights had been shot out. Mura Same engaged American cruisers and destroyers at close range. She helped put USS Monson to the bottom in a devastating close range gun engagement. She had fired to spread torpedoes aimed at the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco. Torpedoes that at least one contemporary account credits with striking the light cruiser USS Juno. Instead, nearly amidships on the port side in the forward fire room. Another account credits the torpedo to the destroyer Amata. The historical record is genuinely contested on that specific point, but this is not contested. Murasame was there. She was firing torpedoes at American ships in the same waters where USS Juno went down. USS Juno sank in 20 seconds. 687 men killed. The 5 Sullivan brothers, all 5 of them from Waterloo, Iowa, went down with her or died in the water that followed. Only 10 survivors were rescued after 8 days. The ships that could have searched for them did not, out of fear of further attack. Those men died in the warm Pacific water, in the dark, waiting for help that didn't come, while the men who may have put them there were already heading north at 30 knots. Mura Seme survived the battle. She was hit in her forward boiler, returned to truck for repairs, and came back. She was back at Vila with her drums on the night of March 5th, 1943. I don't tell you this to make the Japanese sailors into monsters. The men who crewed Murasame were doing exactly what the men on the other side were doing. Their jobs, in the dark, under orders, in a war neither of them started. But it is important, and it is historically honest, to understand that these ships carried the weight of everything that happened in those waters before they made their last run. The Sullivan brothers, the frozen cruisers at Tashafaranga. Every drum rolled over the rail in the dark. Every man who didn't make it back to the beach before dawn. All of that, every mile of it, was already behind Murasame and Mina Gumo when Captain Masao Tachibana ordered them south from the Shortland Islands on the evening of March 5th, 1943. One more run. Vila and back. Simple. Routine. The kind of mission they had made enough times to stop thinking of it as dangerous.
So, a couple of things. I think first and foremost is this episode has an enormous quantity of very difficult to pronounce names, and I am so glad that is your job. I'm not so great at that, but you're doing great. I want to encourage you. Second, again, this is another example of what some might consider minutia in the overall conflict. People focus on the large battles, the stats, the losses, who won, what strategy was advanced, things like that. Here, we see just the routine supply run that Japan is running, what the Allies have to deal with, the technology mismatch. And then, if anybody has watched the movie Saving Private Ryan, you've heard of the Sullivan brothers and the context there. And this is where it happens. And this is what helps to define some American conventions going forward. And so every conflict, even though every mission that is executed by either side, whether it's the Imperial Japanese or the Allies at this point, is an attempt to further their cause in this overall war, and nothing is minor. Everything has to be considered, and if you don't, you die. Like you suffer huge setbacks. And then again, like we've talked about in the previous few episodes, Japan doesn't have the luxury of losing their ships or their crew or any of their experienced members. And that's what they're running into every time they make contact with the Allies. And so we're starting to see more pressure, as if there wasn't enough, but even more pressure on both sides to resolve this decisively. And so this is, it seems like the Solomon Islands are super close to Australia. I know the Pacific Ocean is vast, and so it's really not that close. But I'm sure there were several in Australia that were uncomfortable with the Japanese being that close.
And if you want to know more about the Sullivan brothers, we talked about the USS Sullivan, how she was taking on water as a museum ship. The family that produced Aaron Stanton Merrill had been in Mississippi since before Mississippi was Mississippi. He was born on March 26, 1890, at Brandon Hall in Adams County. Not a house, a plantation seat. The kind of antebellum pile built on wealth so old it had its own gravitational pull. His second great grandfather was Gerard Brandom, one of Mississippi's earliest governors. His grandfather had served as United States minister to Belgium. His father, also called Aaron Stanton, also called Tip, was a Confederate soldier. He came from a lineage that had been fighting on one side or another of American history since before the Republic had finished forming itself. The nickname Tip descended through the family from a great great grandfather who fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe in Indiana in November of 1811. The frontier engagement between Governor William Henry Harrison's militia force and Tuxuma's Confederacy that became, 3 decades later, a presidential slogan. Tippecanoe and Taylor too. Harrison won the presidency on the strength of that nickname. The Merrill family inherited the name itself, wore it down through generations, Confederate soldier to plantation son to Naval Academy graduate, until it landed on the 53-year-old Rear Admiral standing on the flag bridge of USS Montpelier in the absolute pre-dawn darkness of March 6, 1943. When you understand where that name came from and what it carried with it, you understand something about the particular stubbornness that ran through everything Aaron Stanton Tip Merrill did. He entered the Naval Academy in 1908. He graduated in 1912 in the same class that would eventually produce officers who fought across both theaters of the coming World War. At Annapolis, he was remembered for stories, not grades. He was a popular, physical, funny. He won the baton weight boxing title in his 4th year. He wrestled. He played baseball. He was the kind of man other men tended to remember. After commissioning, he spent years building the kind of career that doesn't make headlines, but produces a very specific kind of officer. Gunboat duty on the Yangtze River in China in 1925. Commanding USS Elcano on the deep water patrol that required seamanship, political judgment, and the ability to navigate bureaucracy as well as river currents. Staff work at the Office of Naval Intelligence. Command of USS Wilmington, a destroyer. A posting as aide to Assistant Secretary of the Navy Henry Roosevelt. Time in Chile as naval attaché, where he became the first foreigner to round Cape Horn in a Chilean warship and was decorated for it. Then the Naval War College. Then Tulane University, where he taught naval science and tactics to young men who would go to the same war he was being trained to fight. In April of 1942, he took command of USS Indiana, the brand new South Dakota class fast battleship, commissioned the day Merrill stepped aboard, fresh from the yard at Newport News. 35,000 tons, 9 16-inch guns, 130,000 shaft horsepower. He commanded Indiana through her shakedown, took her through the Panama Canal and into the Pacific, and arrived in the South Pacific in late November 1942, just in time for the campaign's bloodiest final phase, screening carriers and watching the Navy take its punches in the slot. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in January 1943, 2 months before the battle you're going to hear about. 52 years old, 8 months into a war he had spent 30 years preparing to fight. Assigned as Commander Cruiser Division 12, Com Crew Div 12, with USS Montpelier as his flagship. And his first real test in that role, his first introduction to what radar-directed surface warfare actually looked like in the South Pacific, was not a success. At the Battle of Rennell Island on January 29th through 30th, 1943, Merrill was subordinate to Rear Admiral Robert Griffin, commanding Task Force 18 as part of a larger operation to escort reinforcements to Guadalcanal. Merrill's 3 light cruisers, Montpelier, Cleveland, and Columbia, were part of the same formation. What Griffin produced that night was an object lesson in how badly doctrine could fail when a commander didn't understand what radar could and couldn't do. Griffin maintained strict radio silence, even after his radar operators detected incoming Japanese aircraft. He left his anti-aircraft fighters unvectorable. He kept the formation shaped to fight a surface action in waters where the attack came from the air. Japanese torpedo bombers flew in from the dark eastern sky and put 4 torpedoes into USS Chicago. She went to the bottom the following afternoon with 62 of her crew. Merrill watched this happen from Montpelier's bridge. He was not responsible for it, but he absorbed it, cataloged exactly what had gone wrong, and exactly what it told you about the gap between having radar and using it. What separated Merrill from many of his contemporaries was not that he believed in radar. Most of the senior officers in the South Pacific believed in it by early 1943. The problem was that radar was still being used the way earlier captains had used it, as a supplement to eyes, a navigation aid, a detection tool. You saw the contact, you processed it, you passed the information up the chain, you made a human decision, and then you acted. That loop, human eyes confirming what the radar reported, human judgment deciding when the radar was right, human reaction time closing the gap between information and action, was where Japanese lookouts and long lances kept finding the space to operate. What Merrill intended to do was collapse that loop. Not supplement eyes with radar, replace eyes with radar. Close the entire fire control sequence. Detection to tracking to solution to guns. Inside the Combat Information Center, without waiting for a visual confirmation that would never come, in a moonless Pacific night. Shoot at what the radar said was there. Trust the technology completely and build your tactics around its capabilities and its limits. This was not simply a technological choice. It was a doctrinal revolution dressed up as a technical preference. It required his gunnery officers to fire at contacts they could not see. It required his destroyers' skippers to operate based on plot solutions that existed only as green traces on a radar screen. It required his entire task force to act in the dark on the premise that a machine's interpretation of radio waves was more reliable than man's interpretation of the dark. It also required him to address directly the thing that had beaten the Americans every time. They tried to fight the Japanese in the dark. The Long Lance torpedo. Every tactical decision Merrill made in planning the March 6th operation was built around one constraint above all others: do not give them time to shoot. The Japanese couldn't launch torpedoes they hadn't loaded into their tubes, and they couldn't load torpedoes they weren't aimed at a target. So the plan was compression: detect first, fire first, overwhelm first, and collapse the engagement window before the Japanese could even get a weapon in the water. Keep the time between first shell and last sinking below the threshold where a long lance could become a problem. 33 years of career, 6 months of watching the Americans take their lumps in these waters, 8 weeks in command of his own task force. And now, on the night of March 5th, he had an operation order: a force of 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers, a radar system he intended to use as a weapon, and a set of Japanese destroyers that didn't know he was coming. He was 52 years old. His great-great-grandfather had fought in Indiana in 1811. His father had fought under a different flag, and the name had come down to him intact across every American war in between. Tip for Tippecanoe, for the river battle on the frontier, for the moment a man held his ground against forces moving in the dark. In a few hours, it would mean something very different in the Pacific.
I don't often think about commanders who came up through the ranks. Like you think about a Tojo or a Nimitz or Eisenhower or any major player in this conflict. They're just there and they're commanding folks and executing strategy, and only probably those with military interest or enrolled in military colleges would learn more details. But so this background for me is really interesting, not something I would normally be exposed to. And the fact that he was born in 1890, yeah, of course, a lot of these commanders are going to be born in the 1800s and will have seen a lot. Imagine seeing the advent of cars becoming commonplace or radio coming into existence where before there wasn't. It's mind blowing. I know we have a lot of technological advances today, and I try to remind my children, hey, there was a time there was no internet or cell phones or what have you. And the look on their faces of surprise and disgust is gratifying. But anyway, the fact that he came up the way he came up, he saw conflict in various places, he commanded ships. This guy is supremely qualified. And what I fail to realize, and maybe some of our listeners as well, is a lot of these guys that are given command of ships have similar backgrounds, and they've seen a lot, and they know what they're doing, and they're able to anticipate changes that, like, I like what you were saying as far as how strongly he adopted the use of radar and how to implement it differently than his contemporaries probably would have. I liken it to using metal helmets in World War I. Before that, you use cloth helmets. You just represent your nation with your uniform. But machine guns made that a little riskier, so you want to go with metal helmets. And so here we have a technology that has such incredible capability, and I think it's everybody, at least every American, what radar is capable of. But back then, it wasn't quite perhaps fleshed out or tested out, and now we have the right guy in the right place with the right experience to go, you know what? Let's use this to our advantage, because otherwise, fighting at night against the Japanese with their incredible torpedoes, we are literally sunk. And so we have to do something now. And so why not? Like you said, he has been observing the Allies taking their lumps for the past 6 months, and it's time for something bold. And over the past several episodes, we've seen American commanders do something similar with great effect. Something that was unanticipated, whether it was a skip bombing or just direct dive bombing attacks on Japanese carriers, just devastating them in ways that aren't anticipated and where they formerly had the advantage. So we're building up to showtime, and I'm excited to see what happens.
Before we get to the moment the guns open fire, we need to talk about what actually made that night possible, because the Battle of Blackett Strait is not just a story about two Japanese destroyers being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is a story about a specific machine, a specific set of men trained to use that machine in a specific way, and a doctrine built to extract every advantage that machine could offer in the fraction of time before an enemy could respond. Strip the technology out of this story, and what you have left is a conventional night action, the kind the Americans had been losing for a year. Put the technology back in, and you have something new. The machine was the SG radar. The SG stood for Surface Search G model, the designation for the surface search radar that Raytheon developed under the guidance of the MIT Radiation Laboratory. Using magnetron technology the British had shared with the Americans in 1940. It operated in the microwave S band, a significant step forward from earlier long wavelength radars, and it could detect a destroyer-sized contact at roughly 14,000 yards. More importantly, more important than its raw range was what it showed you. Earlier radars gave you spikes on a linear scope, a contact at bearing X, range Y, and nothing else. The SG gave you the Plan Positioner Indicator, the PPI, a circular screen that showed you a top-down picture of everything the radar could see. Your ship at the center, land masses as solid returns, moving contexts, ships as bright blips against the dark background, their positions updating with every sweep of the antenna. It was, for 1943, something close to a God's eye view of the tactical situation. Not in real time, the way we understand real time today. The antenna swept once every few seconds. The picture was updated incrementally. But in the context of a moonless night in the Pacific, where Japanese lookouts and American gunners were otherwise reduced to dark, adapted eyes and experience. In that context, the PPI scope was revolutionary. You could see shapes that were invisible to the human eye. You could measure them. You could track them. Now hold that image, the glowing circular display in the darkened Combat Information Center, and understand what CIC actually meant on a Cleveland-class cruiser in early 1943. The Combat Information Center concept was new. So new, it was barely institutionalized. In earlier ships, radar plots were improvised spaces, often just a corner of a compartment where operators crouched over their scopes without dedicated communication circuits or trained personnel to synthesize what the radar was showing. The CIC was something different, a dedicated nerve center, dimly lit, full of sound-powered phone talkers, plotting tables, and a crew trained to integrate radar information into a coherent tactical picture and push that picture up to the flag bridge where Merrill was making decisions. The sequence from radar contact to gun solution worked like this. The SG operator on Montpelier called out a contact, bearing and range from the PPI display. The CIC plotters marked it on the plotting table, established course and speed from successive sweeps, and generated a fire control solution. That solution, bearing, range, target course, target speed, went to the Mark 34 director, high on Montpelier's superstructure, where the fire control radar, the Mark 8, was tracking the target independently. The Mark 8 had a narrow beam that it kept trained on the contact, feeding continuous range and bearing updates to the fire control computer. The range keeper below decks translated all of that into gun angles and transmitted the solution electronically to the 4 triple turrets carrying 12 6-inch 47 caliber Mark 16 guns. Phone talkers relayed orders. Gun captains confirmed ready. The trigger came from the director. What this produced at the end of that chain was a cruiser capable of placing 12 6-inch shells on a target with a single salvo, without the crew of any turret having ever seen the target with their eyes. Monopolar, Cleveland, and Denver together could generate at maximum fire rate something approaching 360 6-inch shells per minute. That is not a number you absorb quickly. 360 6-inch shells per minute. A shell that weighs roughly 105 pounds, from ships whose crews were navigating, tracking, and firing entirely by radar in total darkness. Now, understand what the Japanese destroyers Murasame and Mimigomo brought to this confrontation. No radar, not a single surface search radar on either ship. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not yet developed surface search radar to its destroyer force in any practical sense. Their detection method was the trained human eye. And here's where you have to resist the instinct to dismiss that. The Japanese lookout system was not a stopgap. It was the product of decades of deliberate, intensive investment in human night vision capability. The Japanese Navy had been planning for decisive night surface action since the 1920s. They selected lookouts for superior night vision, the way you select a pitcher for arm strength. They trained those lookouts continuously in realistic nighttime conditions. They supplied them with enormous pedestal-mounted binoculars, the best night optics in the world at that time, produced by a Japanese optics industry that had been refining the technology for decades. And critically, the Japanese taught their lookouts to cover their eyes before their own guns fired, so the muzzle flash wouldn't destroy their dark adaptation. That is the level of detail they operated at. Nothing wasted, every edge preserved. And it had worked. Through 1942, in the dark waters around Guadalcanal, Japanese lookouts consistently spotted American ships before American radar operators found Japanese ships. Part of the reason the Americans had stopped training realistically at night went all the way back to September of 1923, when 7 destroyers ran aground at high speed in Point Honda, California. A disaster caused by exactly the kind of aggressive night navigation the Japanese never stopped practicing. One accident, 20 years earlier, and American institutional culture backed away from the dark. Japanese standard doctrine, when they did find you, launched torpedoes first, long lances, wakeless, at ranges the American destroyer skippers would have called impossible. Use gunfire only when necessary. Use searchlights as little as possible. They gave away position and wrecked their lookout's dark adaptation. Torpedo first, guns secondary, and here, in the early moments of 1943, that doctrine was still killing American sailors. What Merrill understood, what he had built his operation plan around, was a ruthlessly simple counter. The only way to defeat that doctrine was to take away the time it required. The long lance needed seconds to load and aim, seconds to fill the water with torpedoes, seconds for those torpedoes to run. You couldn't outmaneuver a torpedo you've already been hit by. But if you compressed the engagement from the moment of detection to the moment of destruction, if you fired first, fired accurately, and put your target on the bottom before their tubes were loaded, then the torpedo never entered the equation. The SG radar made that possible. The CIC made it reliable. The Mark 34 director and the range keeper made it fast. What nobody aboard those Japanese destroyers would ever know, what Musara, what Murasama's lookouts, standing behind their enormous binoculars in the dark, had no way of perceiving, was that at midnight on March 6, 1943, a ship they could not see had already been watching them for several minutes, watching them move, watching them close, calculating exactly where they would be when the shells arrived.
That is intense. It's I as you were before you were talking about how the SSG looked and how it operated and how it was implemented. I was wondering like which parties in the war had access to radar and how it was deployed because I know Japan had it, but I think it was reserved mostly for their capital ships. I think battleships and carriers had them, but destroyers did not, if I understand that correctly. And what a humongous advantage. Like I liken it to, I guess, drone technology from the 90s, where if you had a drone in the air and you could see the battlefield unfold before you and you had that information and your opponent did not, you had supreme advantage. And that's basically what we're talking about here. Uh, Being able to contact a ship at 14,000 yards uh, in a moonless sky at night is amazing. And not only can you detect where they are, but where they're going and then calculate where they will be, just like you said, when those shells hit. And so it you think I'm glad you covered the fact that Japan had been ramping up their night vision strategy because it has been supremely effective. We've talked about it in several episodes already. They were able to take out American ships at will at night because of how effective they were. And we tried to avoid that as much as possible. However, this is a game changer. It absolutely is a game changer. And I can't imagine how the feeling on deck when Merrill is using this tool and is comfortably able to track a Japanese fleet as if it's noonday without them detecting him. Uh, those minutes would feel like hours or days. It's like we have all the time in the world to plan what we're about to do. And that luxury rarely occurs. And so I can only imagine as a result, given that he's probably used to making decisions within seconds that need to be executed quickly, what's about to happen is about to be very devastating for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Why don't you tell me what happens next?
Well, before we get to that, we need to talk about a ship that almost no one talks about when they tell you this story.
Oh,
Her name was USS Grampus, and she was somewhere in the Blackett Strait or Vela Gulf that same night, doing a job that has been largely erased from the history of this battle. She belonged there. She was ordered there. She was part of the plan. And 71 men went down with her to a depth and a location that no one has ever found. Let me tell you who she was. USS Grampus, a Tambor class submarine, the U.S. Navy's last pre war fleet submarine design, the cumulation of 20 years of incremental development, the boats that established the configuration that American submarines would carry through the rest of the war. 307 feet, 1,475 tons, surfaced, 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft, with 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, a 3-inch deck gun forward of the conning tower, diesel electric propulsion, 4 General Motors diesels on the surface, 4 General Electric motors submerged, 20 knots on the surface, 8 knots underwater, and a crew of 71 men. She was built by the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, the same yard that had been building American submarines since before the First World War. She was launched on December 23rd, 1940. She was commissioned May 23rd, 1941. She had been in commission for less than 2 years when she departed Brisbane, Australia on February 11th, 1943, in company with her sister submarine, USS Greyback, SS 208, for her 6th war patrol. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander John R. Craig. Her crew had been together through 5 previous patrols. They were, by every measure that mattered, experienced, capable, and tested. In those 5 patrols, Grampus had done things that did not make the newspapers. She had landed Australian coast watchers on Vella La Vella and Choiseul Islands during the worst months of the Guadalcanal campaign, pushing into waters swarming with Japanese warships to put Allied intelligence assets ashore. On that patrol, she absorbed 104 depth charges and escaped unscratched. 104. She had sunk transports and a freighter. She had damaged an enemy destroyer. She had racked up a career total of over 45,000 tons of Japanese shipping across patrols, a record that put her in the first tier of American fleet submarines. On her 6th patrol, the one she did not return from, her orders evolved over the course of 3 weeks. She patrolled first the Buka Shortland Ball sea areas. She damaged the Japanese aircraft ferry Keio Maru off New Britain in mid-February. And then on March 2nd, she received new orders that placed her at the center of the operation we've been talking about. On March 2nd, command directed Grampus to round Cape Henpan, proceeded down the west coast of Bougainville, south of Treasury Island, north of Vella La Vella, and into Vella Gulf on the afternoon of March 5th. Her specific mission: sink any enemy ships trying to pass westward through Blackett Strait in attempting to escape Merrill's surface force, which was scheduled to bombard Vila and Stanmore on March 6th. She was the backstop. If Murasame and Minagumo somehow escaped Merrill and turned west, if any Japanese ship tried to flee back through Blackett Strait to Vella Gulf, Grampus was supposed to be waiting for them. She was part of the kill chain. She was a planned participant in this operation. On the evening of March 5th, Grampus and her partner, Greyback, were both warned by radio. 2 destroyers were proceeding south from Facey, off southern Bougainville, heading towards Wilson Strait. The destroyers you now know as Murasame and Minagumo. The submarines were alerted. The situation was set. And here is where the record starts to fray. Later that same night, March 5th into March 6th, Greyback heard and visually sighted a ship in the area of Vella Gulf, assigned to Grampus. She assumed it was her sister submarine and maneuvered to avoid. But Greyback's radar, the submarine's surface search radar, had been malfunctioning for the entire patrol. She could not get a radar return. She could not exchange recognition signals. She saw something in the dark. She thought it was Grampus. She maneuvered away and said nothing more. She was, by best estimate, no more than 15 miles from Grampus that night. And she heard no depth charges. Grampus never transmitted again. On March 7th, Com Task Force 72 ordered her to send a radio transmission. No response. On March 8th, a second order was sent. Still nothing. On March 22nd, she was officially declared missing, presumed lost with all hands. On June 21st, 1943, her name was stricken from the Naval Register. On March 6th, the day after Grampus went silent, a heavy oil slick was reported in Blackett Strait, near Kolombangara. The official post-war analysis of Grampus losses, drawing on captured Japanese records, reaches this conclusion. It seems likely that Grampus was caught on the surface by the Japanese destroyers and sunk by gunfire. Not depth charges, gunfire, which means she was on the surface, running the night mission she was ordered to run, in the darkness in Blackett Strait. exactly where her orders put her, and Murasama, or Minagumo, or both of them, found her first. And now comes the piece that stops the clock. The only ships that knew what happened to Grampus that night were the ships that killed her. Whatever Murasame's officers logged in their action report, whatever notation was made in whatever record about a submarine encountered in Blackett Strait before they cleared the western end and turned north into Kula Gulf, those records were on those ships when those ships went to the bottom. Hours later, under Merrill's guns, no Japanese record of any Grampus encounter survives. But the witnesses who could have confirmed it were dead before anyone could ask them. 71 men, 6th Patrol, ordered into the dark to hold back the door of an operation they were part of. Ordered into the darkness to hold the back door of an operation they were part of. By planners who thought the whole thing through, and then written out of every headline the victory produced. Because there was no victory for Grampus. There was just the oil slick, and the silence, and the radio calls that never got an answer.
I'm very glad that you brought up Grampus. That is not how I thought it was going to go when you initially brought up that ship. And I thought strategically that made a lot of sense. Like once you start firing, they're going to try to flee away from the source of the danger, right into the arms of another vessel that could decimate them. But obviously, they were lost. And back then, in the World War II era, there were a lot of losses that were not reported based on the government's, not manipulation, but encouragement of the press to say, hey, if you report this, it's going to hurt morale. So don't talk about this. And so they wouldn't. I know one example is the training that they did in preparation for D-Day with the boats that landed on the beaches. There was a horrible tragedy that ended up losing a couple of hundred, maybe even over 1,000 lives in a practice run. And that certainly wasn't reported because that would have really crippled morale, especially right up until they're going to do this dangerous beachhead assault. And so I'm not surprised. It is unfortunate that they were lost with no mention. But I think over time, because the full scope of what happened gets revealed, they do get their due. And so I'm glad we get to be a part of that and just mention their presence and their participation and their sacrifice in this encounter.
Now, hold that, hold all of it, because we need to walk the same night from the other direction. Captain Masuo Tachibana departed Rabaul on March 4th at 4 in the afternoon with 2 destroyers and orders to deliver supplies to Vila. He had done this run before. His ships had done it in various configurations throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. There was nothing unusual about this mission. It was, by the standards of the Central Solomons in early 1943, routine. He stopped at Buin, the Japanese base at the southern end of Bougainville, near the Shortland Islands, and departed again at 1600 on March 5th. His force was Murasama, his flagship, with Lieutenant Commander Yoji Tanagasima as her commanding officer, and Minagumo, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Oisogi. Between them, they carried drums of food and munitions, the standard supply load for a Vila run. Tachibana was the senior officer, his flag aboard Murasama, his authority ultimately that of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's Second Fleet. Here is what they knew as they cleared Buin. Nothing had changed about this route. They had been making runs to Vila for months. The inbound route took them through Vela Gulf and then east through Blackett Strait, threading between Kula Bangara to the north and the smaller Unreldel Islands to the south, until they reached the south coast of Kulumbangara, where Vila sat. That route was familiar. They had run it before. The Japanese knew these waters the way any sailor knows the waters he had crossed repeatedly in the dark. Not as a map, but as a feel, as sequence, as the timing between one landmass and the next. What they did not know was that an Allied coast watcher on Kula Bangara, one of the Australian and New Zealand civilians who had stayed behind in the Solomons when the Japanese occupied the islands, hiding in the jungle with a radio, watching shipping movements and reporting them to Allied command, had spotted two warships departing Faisi harbor at roughly 7 that evening. That report went up the chain. Merrill had it. The submarines had it. Everybody in the operation who needed to know that Murasame and Minagumo were in the water that night knew. Tachibana arrived at Vila at approximately 21:30, pushing through Blackett Strait in the dark. The supply work took roughly an hour. Drums swung over the side, barges from shore pulling them in, crew working fast because a stopped or slowed destroyer in those waters was a dead destroyer. By 22:30, unloading was complete. Tachibana shaped a course for home. And here's the decision. He had come in from the west through Vila Gulf and Blackett Strait. He could return the same way, back through Blackett Strait, westward out into Vila Gulf, and north towards the Shortlands. Or he could take the shorter route east through Kula Gulf, around the northern tip of Kula Bangara, and northwest back up through the slot. The Kula Gulf route was shorter. It was the more common return path for ships that had unloaded at Vila. It put them back in home waters faster, which meant less time exposed. Tachibana chose the shorter route. I want to be precise about what that means and what it doesn't. This was not reckless. It was not the arrogance of a commander who assumed the waters were safe because he'd used them before. It was the same calculation any experienced destroyer captain would make at 22:30 after an unloading operation. Minimize exposure time. Use the faster route. Get out before dawn. There was nothing in Tachibana's available intelligence that told him the Kula Gulf was more dangerous than Blackett Strait that night. The coast watcher who reported his departure didn't send back to him. The traffic Merle was generating as Task Force 68 moved up from the south was silent. No radio transmissions. Navigation by SG radar only. Exactly as planned. Murasamas and Minagumo turned east. They were running at high speed, making for the eastern entrance of Blackett Strait and the opening of Kula Gulf. The night was moonless, completely black. The lookouts were at their stations, those extraordinarily trained men with their pedestal binoculars scanning the dark. The water off the east coast of Kulom Bangara, near Sakambo Key Island. Sambo Key Island was a waterway they knew. They had no reason to expect anything ahead of them. What none of them knew, what the lookouts with their best binoculars in the Pacific couldn't see, was that somewhere to the southwest, in the slot, 6 American ships were already moving. Already had been moving for hours. Were already tracking north-northeast at 20 knots with their radar rotating and their combat information centers live and their gun crews at their stations. Were already as the Japanese pulled away from Vila and headed towards the Kula Gulf, converging on the exact same piece of water from the opposite direction. At 22:30, Tachibana turned east. Merrill was already 30-odd nautical miles away and closing. Both forces moving towards the same unmarked point in the black water between two islands, neither knowing the other was there. There were 69 minutes between that turn and the moment Monopolar's radar operator saw an island that moved.
Oh gosh. One of the things I appreciate about the way we go through what builds up to a conflict. Like, it's very easy to say, to jump to the part that I think is next of when the shooting happens. This provides a lot of background, not only on the Allied side or American side, but the opponent's side, in this case, the Imperial Japanese. What are they expecting? What are they used to? What is their day to day, even? It's something that's overlooked entirely in at least U.S. history classes that I've been a part of. But the society, the culture, the military, the norm, the training, the industrial capacity, all of these elements that are feeding into what is about to happen is relevant. And you don't really know the full picture without context. And I think the more context you provide, especially with the major players as they are about to be involved, you understand their decision making. You understand what resources they have and what constraints they possess. It's a difficult situation on both sides. Now, there have been a couple of times where the Japanese, on paper, seem like they have the advantage, and historically that would be the case here again, given their night vision capabilities, their record with fighting at night, and the knowledge of the waters. Given that they've done this run so many times, uh, it would be almost instinctive to know where they can go, where they can't go, especially at night. That would be particularly dangerous, but not for these guys. And all of that culminates into something different. Like there's an overconfidence that, or I wouldn't say overconfidence, there's a confidence they have, and it's well earned, but that blinds them to a new technology and strategy that's going to be very devastating.
At 013 on March 6th, Task Force 68 slowed to 20 knots. Rear Admiral Aaron Tip Merrill aboard USS Monopolar led the column south into Kula Gulf, the body of water between New Georgia to the east and Kulumbangara to the west, no broader than 15 miles at its widest. The night was, by action report, exceptionally black. No moon. The jungle shorelines of both islands were invisible except as mass on the radar screen. Solid, static returns that told the navigator where he was not, rather than where he was going. Commander Harold Pullen led the destroyer screen. USS Waller and Coney ahead of the cruisers. USS Conway on the port quarter. Navigation was entirely by SG radar. No lights, no visual fix. Just the green, circular picture on the PPI scope, and the men trained to read it. The task force had been moving for hours. They were not surprised, and they were not hurrying. They were executing a plan. A bombardment of the Japanese airfield at Vila Stanmore on the south coast of Kulumbangara, timed and rehearsed. Every ship in its assigned position. They were approximately 44 minutes from the point where they would begin the bombardment run. At 057, USS Monopolar's radar plot reported something that didn't belong. A contact had appeared on the PPI scope. A solid return, approximately 9,000 yards from where the chart said the nearest island should be. The initial read, an island. Charts of these waters were, by every account that exists, imprecise. Running close to inaccurate charted positions in the dark was routine navigational risk out here. The radar operator flagged it. The CIC plotter tracked it. And then the island moved. The return resolved. Within a minute, the contact divided into two separate pips, moving in column, heading towards TF 68 on an opposite course. Range approximately 14,000 yards. Two surface contacts in the water that was supposed to be empty. There are three things happening simultaneously in the next 4 minutes that you need to hold in your mind. In Monopolar's darkened combat information center, the CIC team is processing the data, bearing, range, course, speed of the contacts, and feeding a fire control solution to the Mark 34 directors, high above on the superstructure. At the same time, on the bridge, Merrill is making the decision. And down in the water, 14,000 yards away, and closing on an opposite course, the lookouts aboard Murasame and Minagumo are seeing nothing. Here's what Merrill knew in those 4 minutes. He had two contacts, unidentified, moving fast, in a waterway where Japanese destroyer traffic ran regularly, at a range where his guns could hit them before they could possibly process a radar signature, locate him, calculate a bearing, train their torpedoes, load their tubes, and fire. The entire calculus that he had spent months building his doctrine around. Compress the engagement window, fire before they could respond, deny them the time the long lance needed. That calculus was live right now in real time. Later battles in these same waters would be lost, partially because American commanders paused, because they waited to confirm identification, because they delayed the moment of commitment while Japanese torpedo tubes were trained and loaded. Admiral Cullogan at the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Admiral Wright at Tasafangora, both of them with radar contact, both of them hesitating, both of them bleeding for it. Merrill did not hesitate. At 0101, 4 minutes after contact, USS Monopolar, USS Cleveland, and USS Denver opened fire. 12 6-inch rifles to a salvo on Monopolar alone. The three cruisers together unleashing a weight of metal that few surface engagements in the Pacific had yet seen directed by radar at targets the gunners had never seen with their eyes, would never see with their eyes, whose positions existed in the darkened CIC only as two bright traces on a glowing circular screen. 1 minute later, at 0102, USS Waller loosed her torpedoes, 5 Mark 15s, in a spread aimed by radar plot at a range of roughly 3.5 miles. And aboard Waller in early March 1943, the officer whose pennant flew from her staff was Captain Arleigh Burke, the destroyer commander who would become, in the months ahead, the most celebrated surface warrior in the Pacific, and eventually Chief of Naval Operations for 6 years. The name 31 Knot Burke was not yet famous, but the man was there, in those waters, in that dark, when the torpedoes ran. Hold two images simultaneously. Aboard Murasame, the first salvo has already straddled her. The shells arrived, as American radar-directed fire was supposed to arrive, before anyone in her crew had any idea the ships were there. Murasame's lookout is said to have seen, in that last instant, white flashes on the horizon. Not ships, not a target, muscle flashes. The opening barrage was already in the air before the lookout had a target to report. The first salvo straddled her, the second, the third, each successive ranging salvo walking closer. The fire control computer aboard Monopolar tightening its solution with each new range and bearing report from the Mark 8 director radar. 6 salvos in approximately 3 minutes. The 6th salvo hit home, the first confirmed hit of the action, and Murasame began to burn. At approximately 0115, one of Waller's 5 torpedoes connected. The explosion was described in the Japanese records as extremely violent. Murasame broke in two. She caught fire. She was gone. The blast was reportedly heard by Captain Robert Briscoe's destroyer force conducting their own bombardment of Munda, 25 miles away.
Wow.
The sound carrying through the dark across 25 miles of open water. 128 men were killed in the sinking of Murasame. Captain Masao Tachibana, the squadron commander, survived. Lieutenant Commander Yoji Tanagasima, Murasame's captain, survived. 53 men swam for Kumlumbangara in the darkness and made it. The time between first radar contact and the torpedo hit that broke Murasame in two, 18 minutes. And now Minagumo was alone, and the guns had already shifted.
That is crazy. That is such a detailed and visually compelling description of what happened. When I think about at this point, American torpedoes are unreliable, like notoriously. But the fact that one of them broke a Japanese ship in half is surprising and incredible. And uh, that is, this is what we expected, though, right? When you have the vision that radar provides, and you have an opponent that is unaware, you're able to do this kind of stuff. And then what is more shocking for the Japanese is not only do they lose a ship almost immediately, and like you said, with no time to load torpedoes, no time to prepare for a fight, which I have a question about. Why don't I assume they don't have torpedoes already loaded because it's an explosion risk, or do they have to be calibrated a certain way before they're loaded?
You don't load live ordnance until you intend to use it.
Okay, that's what I figured. It just seems like a bad idea because if you get hit in the torpedo tubes, it would make a bigger mess. Uh, but anyway, the fact that once the initial hit occurs, the Americans are already tracking the second hit. And you were mentioning earlier the rate of fire that was capable from these ships. You said 360 shells a minute, which, of course, with arithmetic's help, gets me to 6 shells a second. That is stunning. That is incredibly destructive. And that is the fate that is about to befall the next ship. And, oh, yes, also, I'm amazed that people are able to swim in the dark to safety that far. I think that just is more a projection on how weak of a swimmer I happen to be. But that is amazing. I'm glad they were able to make it to safety.
At the moment the cruisers shifted fire, a matter of seconds after the torpedo hit on Murasama, Minagumo's crew understood several things simultaneously. The companion ship was gone. The Americans knew exactly where they were, and they could not find the Americans. Somewhere off the starboard bow, somewhere across the water that their lookouts were searching with the finest binoculars in the Pacific, were ships. Ships that had been firing since 0101, with an accuracy that had already destroyed Murasame in minutes. Ships that no man aboard Minagumo could locate because the Americans had fired without ever showing a searchlight, without ever illuminating a flare, without giving a single optical cue that a human eye could track to its source. The only thing Minagumo's crew could see were the muzzle flashes, intermediate blooms of light on the horizon. There, then gone, as 3 cruiser main batteries opened fire and closed. Not ships, flashes. Lieutenant Commander Yoshioe Sogi passed orders to return fire. He aimed for the flashes. This was the only aiming solution available to him. Train the guns on the place where the light had been. Calculate where the ships must be. Fire. It was exactly what Japanese destroyer doctrine called for in a night engagement, where torpedo attack wasn't possible. Use the guns. Aim at what you can see. Don't stop. I want to say something directly and without flinching about what Lieutenant Commander Yoshioe Sogi and his crew were doing in those minutes, because the record gets compressed into casualty figures and it loses something essential in that compression. These were trained, experienced sailors doing the only thing that was available to them. They could not launch torpedoes. The American fire was too rapid, the disorientation too complete, and Merrill's plan to collapse the engagement window before the long lances could be readied had worked exactly as intended. So they fired guns at muzzle flashes, at the ghost of where the ships had been. They were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were destroyermen trying to fight in a situation where the fundamental asymmetry of the technology had already decided the outcome. And they fought anyway. That is worth knowing before we get to the end of the story. The cruiser's fire was walking into Manigomo systematically. The CIC on Monopolar had her tracked. The Mark 8 fire control radar on the director was holding her. Every salvo adjusted on the prior hit, tightening the solution. USS Waller had been ordered to close and finish Minagomo with torpedoes if she still floated. But Minagomo was being hit so fast and so heavily that by the time Waller could reach firing position, there was nothing left to torpedo. Minagomo had headed north, fighting, taking hits, losing speed as her engineering spaces were torn apart. She ran approximately 4 miles under continuous fire, and then she stopped. When a ship stops under that kind of pressure, when a ship stops under that kind of punishment, it means several things have gone wrong at once. Boiler casings ruptured, steam lines severed, turbines that could not turn because they have no steam to drive them, or because the reduction gears that connect them to the propeller shafts are wrecked. The engineering spaces on a Asashio class destroyer like Minagomo held the machinery that kept the ship alive. The boilers producing steam at high pressure, the geared turbines turning that pressure into shaft revolutions, the shafts transmitting those revolutions to the propellers. When shells penetrate that space and the steam releases, it releases catastrophically. Men in the engineering spaces of a destroyer that takes a direct hit there have almost no chance. Minagomo went dead in the water. At 0114, 13 minutes after the first salvo, Rear Admiral Aaron Tip Merrill ordered firing ceased. Both Japanese destroyers had been neutralized. His CIC had confirmed no further contacts on the PPI scope. The gun crews stood down. The Combat Information Center shifted its attention from fire control to navigation. Task Force 68 completed a turn to starboard, coming around to the north east of Blackett Strait and north of Tunguith Rila Point. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Oi Sogi did not survive. 46 men from Minagomo were killed. 122 went into the water alive. There were also 128 dead from Murasama, and 53 of her crew in the water as well. That is, in total, 174 dead and 175 men swimming in the pre-dawn darkness of the Pacific, in the warm water around Kula Bangara, with no ships coming for them. They swam for Kula Bangara. Most of them made it. The accounts that survived suggest it took approximately 7 hours. The sun would have been coming up by the time the last survivors pulled themselves onto the island shore. Captain Masao Tachibana, Lieutenant Commander Yoji Tanagi Shima, Murasama's captain, made it. 2 survivors from Minagomo were later found and captured by American forces. The rest reached Japanese lines. I'm not going to tell you Merrill should have done it differently. In warfare, an enemy combatant in the water is a different morale category than an enemy combatant on a warship. The American ships did not strafe survivors, did not fire on men in the water. Merrill disengaged, executed his mission, and left. What happened to the survivors in those 7 hours of warm, black water belongs to the war's broader ledger of cost, not to this engagement's command decisions specifically. At 0124, 16 minutes behind schedule, Task Force 68 began its bombardment run along the south coast of Kulumbangara, the same coast where the survivors of Murasame and Minagumo were in the water swimming. The guns spoke again, this time aimed north, directed by a reconnaissance aircraft overhead, targeting supply dumps and runways and aircraft on the ground at Vila. 16 minutes late, on schedule in every meaningful sense. the war continuing on its timetable regardless of what lay in the water behind them. Zero American ships damaged, zero American casualties. The engagement from first radar contact to last gun report, 37 minutes. The engagement from first shot to cessation of fire, 13 minutes. And somewhere in the southern waters of Kula Gulf, the radio that could have told the world what happened to USS Grampus was already at the bottom.
I think, I don't know, you covered it pretty well already. War is a difficult moral, and throughout history, there's been a complex array of is decide like what is appropriate, what isn't, what leaders decide to do with enemy combatants once the main objective is completed. I mean, like you mentioned in an earlier episode, American fighters strafed men in the water and took them out. That was a decision they made. Merrill here doesn't, he just leaves the folks in the water. Is it incumbent on a ship of any nationality, but in this case American, to pick up survivors of the opposing force? I don't know. I think from a military strategy perspective, that compromises a lot of things, and that can make things very difficult. Ah, it's good that the Americans were able to achieve such stunning success, but it is also important to highlight the cost that comes with that, not just um, what we mentioned earlier with Grampus, but the human toll. Like that there are men that die as a result of this. And yes, that is the case with every military conflict, but it should be repeated. Like this is a fact of the matter, and it needs to be mentioned. Yeah, maybe consider the cost before going to war. That that's something that needs. There's a lot of folks, I guess, through my life that have said we need to go to war with XYZ, whoever the enemy is, whoever the obstacle is, or whoever's opposing our nation's interests at the time. Yeah, but you can say that, but who is doing the fighting? Who is sacrificing their life for whatever objective that you have in mind? That's, I don't know. That's been weighing heavily on me lately, and I can see it here as well. So, yeah, just think about it, nations.
The bombardment lasted 16 minutes, from 0124 to 0140. On March 6th, the guns of USS Monopolar, the Cleveland, the Denver spoke north, directed by a spotter aircraft overhead, targeting the Japanese supply infrastructure at Villa Stanmore on the south coast of Kulumbangara. Supply dumps, runways, buoyvacs, dispersed aircraft, 128 dead from Murasama and 46 from Minagumo, 174 men, and 175 more swimming somewhere in the water behind them. And the guns fired for 16 more minutes into the infrastructure that those men had died to supply. Japanese shore batteries returned fire. Counter battery fire from the cruisers knocked them out quickly. At 0140, Rear Admiral Aaron Tip Merrill ordered withdrawal. Task Force 68 cleared out through the New Georgia Sound, navigating south, back down the slot. No American ships damaged, no American casualties. Total time inside the engagement zone from entry into Kula Gulf at 013 to exit at 0140, 1 hour and 27 minutes. Back at base, Merrill filed his after-action report. And in that report, he described sinking 2 Japanese light cruisers. Not destroyers, light cruisers. The NHHC, the Navy History and Heritage Command, reviewed this discrepancy and noted, without surprise, that Merrill's misidentification was typical of the constant misidentification and inflation of enemy losses that characterized U.S. operational reporting throughout the war. They added, with the dry fairness that institutional historians occasionally manage, quote, Japanese reports were much worse. I want to address this directly because there's a difference between an honest mistake and a self-serving one. And the record in this case is ambiguous enough that you should know both possibilities exist. The Asashio class destroyers like Minagumo were large ships, over 1,900 tons, nearly 389 feet, designed to be light cruiser killers. At 11,000 yards in the dark, tracked by radar, returned on a PPI scope without visual confirmation. A big destroyer could read as a small cruiser to an interpreter who hasn't slept in 30 hours and was running his fire solution under combat conditions. The initial Coast Watcher report had identified the ships as possibly cruisers, so there were reasons to make the error. But there was also incentives to keep it. Two cruisers sunk, zero American casualties is a different headline than two destroyers sunk. It maps differently onto a theater commander's campaign record. It justifies a task force's expenditure of ammunition more impressively. It generates more favorable language from Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who is in this case praised the operation as a credible performance, noting specifically that TF 68 had picked up enemy ships by radar against a land background. Closed to fire control solution sank them in, as Nimitz puts it, a business-like manner, and then executed their bombardment mission approximately on schedule. His follow-up line has become the one people quote. It has earned its place. Quote, the operation had all the precision of a well-rehearsed exercise by veteran ships, which these were not. These were not veteran ships. Monopolar had commissioned in September 1942, Cleveland in June, Denver in January 1943, barely 6 weeks before this engagement. The destroyer crews were greener still. What they had instead of experience was Merrill's doctrine and radar. They'd been trained to trust completely, and on the night of March 6th, those two things were enough. Now, here's the thing that has always bothered me about how this action gets remembered. The NHHC notes bluntly and accurately that this battle has no name in Samuel Elliott Morrison's official multi-volume history of U.S. naval operations in World War II. The action that Merrill described as sinking two light cruisers doesn't have an entry. Battle of Blackett Strait is a modern convention. More precisely, the NHHC notes the fight took place not in Blackett Strait at all. It took place in Kula Gulf to the east. The Japanese were heading into the Kula Gulf when they were hit. The strait was behind them. The name honors the geography of the Japanese route, not the geography of the engagement. And even then, it applies to the wrong water. The NHHC's preferred name, the First Battle of Kula Gulf, a name that never stuck because something else happened there in July 1943 and took the headline. An unnamed victory, two inflated kills, and a credible performance for ships green enough that executing the drill correctly was itself the accomplishment. But the Strait did not forget. On the night of May 6th to 7th, 1943, exactly 2 months after Merrill's guns went silent, USS Radford, leading three destroyer mine layers, USS Gamble, USS Breeze, and USS Preble, moved silently into Blackett Strait and laid 250 Mark VI mines in 17 minutes. They withdrew without detection. The following night, Japanese Destroyer Division 15, Oyashio, Kagaro, Kuroshio, came through the same water after a resupply run to Vila. Oyashio hit first. Flagship, dead in the water. Kagiro hit next, dead in the water. And then Kuroshio, still circling to protect her sisters, hit multiple mines. She was torn apart and sank in seconds. 83 men killed instantly. An Australian coast watcher on Kulumbangara watched the whole thing. Radioed Henderson Field, and the SBD Dauntless dive bombers went out in the morning and finished Kagaro and Oyashio where they sat. 3 more destroyers in the same strait in 2 months. And Merrill had made the enemy bigger in his report than the enemy actually was. What does it tell you about institutional incentives? About the machinery of commendation and after action reporting, and the distance between what a commander saw on a radar screen and what he put on paper. When a man who just won a clean, complete, zero casualty victory felt the need to inflate it.
This story is one, I tell you this almost every episode, is one that I have not heard before. And it seems like every retelling of these events, I get a little bit better picture of what our Navy is capable of, what they had to face, and then also the same for Japan. And I also think about the progress of technology. Just what was happening at this time? What was what was each side capable of? And when you were describing at the beginning the Long Lance torpedoes and how devastating those were, it it kind of that was a consistent quality produces results, I guess, because compare the Japanese torpedoes relative to the American torpedoes were superior. American torpedoes were iffy, sometimes duds, and I think this is about the time that they started getting the feedback that, hey, your stuff isn't working, torpedo manufacturers, and they started upping their game and increasing reliability. I don't know if this is the battle that those reliable torpedoes start showing up, but they certainly did their job. Um, I also try to put myself in the shoes of you're sitting on a ship, and then all of a sudden there's an explosion, and you and 82 of your crewmates are dead. That is how quickly things can change in wartime. And I don't know. You've given me a lot to think about. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Uh, but that's kind of why we do this. We review the history of it. We look at the details. We look at how this fits into the overall picture, how this impacts individual lives of not just the sailors, the crew, sometimes the civilians in the general area, which I don't think, at least it wasn't mentioned here, how they were affected. But it matters to look back at these things and think about what got us here, what was happening, what were they fighting for or against, and what were the consequences that led to victory or defeat. And I think there's a lot of lessons that are learned at each engagement that you talk about, and I'm trying to pick them up, not only to internalize them for myself, but also adjust my view of the world based on where we've been before.
There is a battle with no name in the standard histories. Samuel Eliot Morison wrote 15 volumes on U.S. naval operations in World War II, and he was there for much of it. His work remains 8 decades later the foundational text for anyone who wants to understand how the American Navy fought. And in those 15 volumes, the engagement we've been calling the Battle of Blackett Strait, the first clean surface victory of the Solomons campaign, the action that proved American radar doctrine could break the back of Japanese night supremacy, doesn't have a name. It doesn't have an entry. It happened, and the history moved on. That is its own kind of comment on how war gets remembered. Here's what this battle actually changed. Before the night of March 6, 1943, the question in the Solomons was not whether American radar was technologically superior to Japanese night optics. Everyone with a chart knew it was. The question was whether American commanders could trust it enough to act on it without hesitation, without the instinct to confirm visually, to wait for one more second of certainty, to pull back from the moment of commitment. Rear Admiral Aaron Tip Merrill answered that question in 4 minutes. From radar contact to guns firing, 4 minutes. No hesitation, no visual confirmation, no pause to wonder whether the pips on the PPI scope might resolve into something friendlier if he waited. Every subsequent radar ambush in the Solomons was a version of that 4-minute decision. The Battle of Vila Gulf in August 1943, where Commander Frederick Moosbrugger's destroyers hit a Japanese transport force without taking a single hit. The Battle of Cape St. George in November of 1943, where Captain Arleigh Burke, the same Burke whose pennant flew in USS Waller on the night of March 6th, sank 3 destroyers without loss and without an American casualty. The blueprint was here. March 6, 1943, Kula Gulf. The blueprinters got a credible performance. The battle also demonstrated something about the cost of the campaign that surrounded it. 2 destroyers sunk in 13 minutes, 0 American casualties, and yet 174 Japanese dead, 175 men in warm, dark water for 7 hours, 71 American submariners, the crew of USS Grampus, gone without a confirmed date, without a confirmed cause, without a wreck that anyone has ever found. 3 Japanese destroyers, Kuroshio, Kagero, destroyed in Blackett Strait 2 months later by mines that were planted because this victory proved the strait's vulnerability. 250 mines in 17 minutes. Then aircraft from Henderson Field. Then silence. This is what the campaign looked like in those waters in 1943. Quick, thorough, asymmetric, and explosive to everyone. The scorecard runs clean on the American side. The human cost runs deeper than the scorecard captures. Now, let me say some names before we close. Lieutenant Commander J.R. Craig commanded USS Grampus on her 6th and final patrol. He took her out of Brisbane on February 11th and was never heard from again. He had 70 men under his command. All 71 are listed on the tablets of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines. A wall for men who have no grave because the Pacific swallowed them whole. They are also named at the National Submarine Memorial West at Point Loma, California. We don't know when Grampus went down. We don't know exactly where. The best current assessment is that the same 2 destroyers she was stationed to intercept, Murasame Minagomo, caught her on the surface of the dark on the night before the battle the history books don't name, and killed her with gunfire before either ship went to its own end a few hours later. But that is not confirmed, and it never will be. The destroyers that might have done it took whatever they knew straight to the bottom. 71 men, no wreck, no date, no answer. On the Japanese side, 128 men went down with Murasame. Among them, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Fakumura, who died in his engineering spaces. The surgeon, Lieutenant Yamamoto Shoszo, who died attending to his shipmates when the guns found them. 46 from Minagomo, including Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Oisogi, who passed orders to fire at muzzle flashes in the dark, who held to his post until the engineering spaces failed and the ship stopped and there was nothing left to command. I want to be precise about something. Acknowledging the dead on both sides of a war is not the same as drawing a false equivalence between the causes those sides were fighting for. It is not the same as executing the imperial project that sent those ships down the strait. The Japanese Empire in 1943 was engaged in a war of colonial conquest with a brutality that has no shortage of documentation. But Uesugi and Fukamura and Yamamoto Shoszo and the 170 men beside them were not the architects of that project. They were just sailors doing the job they were assigned with the training they had in waters they had crossed dozens of times. They died in 13 minutes for a supply run. The history of war contains their names, whether the headline battles do or not. The strait itself carries someone else's name. Blackett Strait is named for Lieutenant Frederick Arthur Blackett of the Royal Navy, born 1846, died 1880. 34 years old, served on HMS Thalia on the China Station in the early 1870s. He surveyed these waters when they were a cartographic blank. He never fought anyone here. He never knew this place would matter. The charts that those navigators of Murasima and Minagomo and Montepleur all used to run their courses that night had his name on them because he looked at the water carefully enough and long enough that someone thought to remember him that way. A name for the place. That's what survives. The battle that happened here on March 6, 1943 is under-recognized for the same reason most genuinely instructive events are under-recognized. It was decisive without being dramatic at the scale history tends to memorialize. No American ships were lost. No American dead. 13 minutes from first shot to silence. A clean, cold, professionally executed ambush that changed the way the U.S. Navy fought at night in the Pacific, and it never got its own chapter. 71 men on the tablets of the missing in Manila, 174 sailors in the warm water off Kulambengara, an unnamed action in an unnamed strait that changed the war. We name it here.
I think that's utterly appropriate. And I think it's important to remember the names of people that gave their lives in this conflict. I think about the compulsion that different countries have in their military. Sometimes you must serve, and there is no if and or but about it. I know at this time the Americans had the draft, but there was also a huge wave of voluntary enlistment after Pearl Harbor. Some of those guys didn't want to be there, and this was their fate, and they were doomed once the guns opened fire. And I like that you do this, Dale, and that you mention the humanity in all of this, because that's really what matters. I like the Navy, the U.S. Navy specifically, and I love history. But you can't just state dry facts and figures without knowing that there are real people that are involved in these situations.
All right, Christoph, why don't you get us out of here, bud?
All right, listener. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. I hope, man, I always learn something. I hope you do too. And if you already knew all this stuff in that event, I hope you were at least entertained and you're like, yeah, nodding along as you pointed at your, I was going to say radio, but your audio device. If you ever want to get a hold of us because you thought our storytelling was so great or the history was so wonderful or I don't know, for any reason, you can do that in a couple of different ways. You can email us at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on X Twitter. We have a handle, and the handle is at USHistoryPod. There's also a Discord server that you can join. You can find a link to that in the show notes. Join in. Talk to folks. Listen to other folks. It's cool. And then finally, if you could tell other people about this podcast that you think would enjoy it. Is there a particular episode that stood out to you that your friend or family member or coworker would really enjoy? Share it with them. We love seeing that people listen and that people are interested in the history that we share. So thank you so much for listening, and we hope to catch you next time.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Bye, everybody.
Take care.